Well, I think that is very well said, and it sadly speaks to the next story we want to turn to, which is America absolutely trying to send more money to buy more weapons to Israel, as well as Ukraine and other things to continue, certainly the slaughter in Gaza, among many other conflicts. And we are very, very happy to be joined here once again by Walter Smolarek, who is the editor of Liberation News, to discuss this. Walter, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you for having me back.
Well, as you know, I don't know if everyone pays attention to the back and forth in Congress on a daily basis, but yesterday, of course, the massive package that's supposed to fund war in Israel, Ukraine, and the South China Sea failed over some other issues. But maybe first and foremost, before we get into the politics of it, Walter, if you could just give us some brief view of what this supplemental budget contains, what they're trying to push through.
That's right. I mean, it's all of the worst, most evil, murderous priorities of the U.S. empire packaged together into one piece of legislation. And then, if that wasn't enough, they added on top of that. The politicians in Congress added on top of that billions of dollars for anti-immigrant repression, for militarization along the U.S.-Mexico border. So the largest chunk of this supplemental bill, what they're calling a supplementary defense spending bill, would go to Ukraine. The exact numbers are still in flux, but approaching $70 billion would be spent providing more and more weaponry to Ukraine to keep the proxy war going. When it comes to Israel's genocide in Gaza, which is really a U.S.-Israeli genocide, the bill would allocate over $14 billion. Over $14 billion on top of the $3.8 billion that's already given on a regular basis every year to Israel in weaponry. And then there's some number of billions of dollars for Taiwan to pump up the new Cold War with China. The language they're using on that is a little opaque, but at least $2 billion for military weaponry, for funding to Taiwan, which China and almost every country on earth recognizes as being part of China. And then, because there is this current in the Republican Party that is opposed to or postures as being opposed to the proxy war in Ukraine, at least rhetorically, there's this other provision where many billions of additional dollars, about $8 billion, would be directed towards ICE and to border patrol. And then that may be coupled with really, really reactionary anti-immigrant changes to U.S. asylum and humanitarian parole laws. This is all in one package, one piece of legislation that contains all of these horrific priorities that are totally out of step with public opinion.
Oh, you're muted.
Walter, sorry about that, guys. It was recently reported, Walter, that the Biden administration is basically warning Ukraine that they're going to cut the funding off at some point soon. What's going on there? What are the details there? Is that actually happening? Or is it just, empty rhetoric? I'm never sure with this stuff because you also have U.S. officials running around saying Israel's doing everything it can to avoid civilian casualties, and we're encouraging them to keep doing that. Meanwhile, that hasn't happened. It's only gotten more lethal to be in Gaza.
That's right. I mean, I think U.S. Policymakers are in a bind here because on the one hand, they're frustrated with Ukraine. I think that the counteroffensive didn't pan out, right? I mean, we were told for months and months and months, the public was told for months, and government officials were told for months too, that Ukraine just needed a little bit more money, a little bit more time, and then they would blast through Russian lines and end the war. They would liberate Crimea, they would march on the Donbass, and the war would be over in this sweeping counteroffensive. But in fact, the Ukrainian armed forces have accomplished very, very little since that began in May or June. And so I think, we do see these sort of public expressions, or, maybe they're quoted anonymously in the media, expressions of frustration from the Biden administration, from the Pentagon, from the State Department. But at the same time, the U.S. government is still absolutely committed to its new Cold War policy with Russia and with China, right? The strategic or this great power competition strategic doctrine. They know that if Russia does succeed in Ukraine, right, if the outcome of the war in Ukraine is perceived as a Russian victory, that would also be devastating to their long-term plans for domination of the entire globe. So I think that we see these public expressions of frustration, but at the same time, a deep commitment by the Biden administration to keep throwing billions and billions and billions of dollars into this war, rather than spending it on things that people actually need here in the United States or around the world. They're still committed to that because they know that the outcome would be so bad for them, essentially, if Russia were to come out of this being perceived as the victor.
Walter, there's kind of a deep irony in a lot of this to me in terms of how the Democrats are posturing, because on the one hand, with the anger that's coming, especially out of the Arab and Muslim community, with people saying that they are fed up and not going to vote for Joe Biden, the Democrats saying, well, immigration, Muslim ban, camps or whatever. But the irony I'm pointing to here is that it seems that this bill is 100% resting on its passing on whether or not the Democrats will agree to some pretty hardcore immigration measures, which to me seem to kind of add up to a lot of the things they claim people should vote for them to prevent.
That's right. I mean, the things that are on the table, according to reports, as the senators are negotiating with each other, are absolutely horrific. I mean, it would make the Biden administration's immigration policy even more indistinguishable than Trump's. Maybe minus the racist rhetoric, although we still get a lot of that too. So the key thing, or one of the key things, is humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole basically means that if you arrive in the United States and you apply for asylum, which is a guaranteed legal human right under U.S. and international law. If you apply for asylum, humanitarian parole means that under certain circumstances, you don't have to stay in detention. You don't essentially have to stay in prison while the while that case is going through the legal system, while a court is determining the status of your asylum application. A very basic baseline thing that you can do to treat people with the most the smallest modicum of human decency. The Republicans want to end that, and the Democratic Party politicians may be so committed to the proxy war in Ukraine, they may be so committed to the genocide in Gaza, that they would actually agree to that. And say that, well, if you're applying for asylum, you have to stay in prison, and your whole family has to stay in prison too. If we add that to the fact that the Title 42 policy, which is what the Trump administration used to deny asylum to virtually everybody, to everyone who arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border, that's been replaced by another series of policies that the Biden administration came up with that effectively has the same effect. It's really a reintroduction of the quote-unquote safe third country policy that Trump also implemented and was ruled illegal by the Supreme Court. If they do that and they end humanitarian parole, I don't know how the Democrats are going to go out on the campaign trail and pretend like they're any different from the Republicans when it comes to immigrant rights.
I mean, so listen, Walter, we've got people very angry at the Biden administration, right? I'm angry at the Biden administration. The numbers don't look good for them if they stay this way. Not trying to make this too much about horse race, but you see, and not to make it about lesser evilism, but it does seem like our choices are becoming increasingly between pro-genocide and pro-genocide more enthusiastically. I don't even know how to define it. What differentiates these parties at this point? They're all voting to fund the same wars. I mean, yeah, there's this handful of Democrats that are no, we support a ceasefire, and we don't, but it's inconsequential in terms of numbers. So what differentiates these parties at this point? They both lock people up and deport them. They both are very committed to Israel's genocide in Gaza. They're both very committed to, war with China. They're both, except for a few Republicans, they're both pretty committed to the war in Ukraine. What's the difference?
It's a really good question, right? I mean, I think that's a good way to put it. It's like genocide versus genocide with nastier words attached to it. It's so minimal, the difference between the two. I think you can make the same argument when it comes to economic policies. I mean, clearly the Democrats haven't done anything to alleviate the suffering of working people. On foreign policy, they have, saying that they have blood on their hands is an understatement. I mean, it's incredible, the atrocities, the slaughter that they've underwritten, that they've financed, that they've defended in public. When it comes to immigrant rights, like we've been talking about, very little to no difference. And I think that this is something that, the smarter people in the Democratic Party apparatus, machinery, the strategists are really, really worried about, because especially when it comes to young people, especially when it comes to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, there's this growing sentiment. I think it's completely correct and righteous, that we shouldn't reward the Democrats with our vote. If they're going to act like this, if they're going to wield their power to commit crimes of this magnitude, I cannot, in good conscience, many millions of people are thinking to themselves, I cannot, in good conscience, go out and vote for Joe Biden or vote for any other Democrat. And I think that's why there's a really big sentiment out there that we need to find progressive, left-wing, independent, third-party candidates to essentially to replace the Democratic Party, because lesser evilism is such a weak and uncompelling argument in the eyes of so many millions of people right now.
Walter, I was hoping you could talk about something you mentioned in the first answer, which is some of the trade-offs that are at play here when we look at this kind of spending. I remember when I first looked at the bill, it was like I don't know if this will end up in the final bill, but they were proposing just over $1 billion for the Iron Beam, which is not even a real weapon. It's just like an experimental laser weapon. And I just thought to myself, well, that really says a lot that we'll spend over $1 billion on an experimental laser weapon when the country feels like it's falling apart in so many ways around us. So, talk about that a little bit if you could, the sort of absurdity of what's already happening is they're passing a budget with a lot of cuts while adding a supplemental budget that's only for war.
Yeah. If you look at the official summary of this bill that was put out by the Democrats, by the people who introduced the bill, the language they use is investing in the defense industrial base of the United States. Investing in the defense industrial base, investing in the industrial base, that means subsidies to Boeing, to Lockheed Martin, to Raytheon, to all of the big war profiteering and genocide profiteering corporations. So while this is, it's true that this is money for Ukraine, for Taiwan, for Israel, it's generally delivered in the form of essentially like gift cards, right? It's like, you can redeem X amount of money at US-based weapons manufacturing corporations. It remains to be seen what this $14 billion of additional funding, how that'll be administered. But when it comes to the $3.8 billion of aid that the US gives to the Israeli military every year, that is how it works. That's the legal mechanism, right? It's like, you can go to a US-based weapons manufacturing corporation and spend up to $3.8 billion, and the US government will cover the cost of that. And so, investing in the defense industrial base, it's a way for them to win on two fronts, essentially, right? The Pentagon and the State Department get their geopolitical, geostrategic benefit. And then their friends at the board of directors of these major corporations and all of the big banks that invest in these major arms manufacturing corporations get all of the benefits of the additional business.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Were you
going
to say something? Oh,
nope.
I was just going to ask you, okay, all this said, what do we do? That's a big question, Walter. What do we do?
It's a good question. I think that the mass movement and solidarity with Palestine is so inspiring. It's unbelievable how fast public opinion has changed, and also the massive way that sea change in public opinion is manifesting itself in the streets. So we had 500,000 people go to Washington, D.C. on November 4th to show solidarity with the people of Palestine. That gave birth to the Shut It Down for Palestine movement, where in hundreds and hundreds of cities and towns across the country and around the world, it's international in scope too, have had many international days of action to disrupt business as usual, to make it clear that there will be no business as usual until Palestine is free, until the genocide ends. The next day of action, by the way, is tomorrow for Shut It Down for Palestine. I think there's also, on a less massive scale, but still in a very real way, a movement opposed to the new Cold War, to U.S. Financing of the proxy war in Ukraine, to endless U.S. aggression against China, because clearly that is setting the world on the path to World War III, to devastation. So I think that for that movement to continue to grow, to mobilize, to become more disruptive, bolder, more militant, that's crucially important. And I think that is what's going to happen, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Walter Smolarek, editor of Liberation News, as always, thank you for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.